Yo, 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 live the life! Whoop! Hello friends, we are here in beautiful Montreal, Quebec, in my neighborhood. I'm here with my homestay student from New Jersey, that's how you pronounce it, Michael Nicolidakis, Ella Cavalierimu, and from Montreal, my good friend Monsieur Brendal. Did you understand that?
No.
The Greeks will understand it. For those who don't know me, I am based in Montreal, Quebec. I'm a gypsy jazz guitarist, and I mean, sounds cocky to say this, but I think I'm pretty well known in this style of music. And I do workshops all over the world. I've played with pretty much all the big names in this style. I'm also the owner of DC Music School, where I've produced a lot of lessons for a lot of players: guitar, violin, bass, clarinet. And you may find that different musicians have different opinions on certain things, and sometimes they're in conflict with each other. And that's totally fine, because just like in life, everyone has their own opinions about how to live life. Some are part of this religion, some are not, some have these political views, others don't. All that is fine, and it's important for you to discover where you stand on certain things, and you may evolve as time goes by. In this video, I just want to give you some general tips that may help you get started in your jazz journey, and hopefully make sense of what people say afterwards, so that you can form your own opinions. So today I want to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is to teach classical musicians, namely string players, how to learn to improvise or to play jazz music. This is something that I've been doing for a few years now. So before I continue, people often use the terms improvisation and learning jazz interchangeably. For me, they're two distinct topics. Just because you can improvise doesn't mean you can play jazz, even if you're playing over jazz standards. And furthermore, I think playing jazz is more than just improvisation. There's a whole culture, vocabulary, history behind that goes beyond improvisation. So there are two distinct topics, and we'll cover that. If you were to ask me, improvisation is best learned in the context of a musical style, whether it be rock, pop, jazz, blues, bluegrass, or whatever. I think the best way, for me anyway, the best way to learn improvisation is within such a context. Since we're all jazz musicians here, at least we try to be, wannabes, posers, we're going to talk about this in the context of jazz music, and to be more specific, we play what people consider to be gypsy jazz, or music inspired by Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli. So for those who don't know, gypsy jazz is a style of music that was popularized by Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli in the 1930s. In fact, personally, I don't really like the term gypsy jazz because it's a bit of a complicated topic, but we'll just use that term for now because it's the easiest one. This music has close ties to jazz music from the 1930s. Players such as Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, Big Spider Beck, Kanye West, Lester Young, and so forth. In fact, Django and Stefan Grappelli were playing music in that style, and gypsy jazz is something that came later on. But that's a topic deserving of its own video. If you want me to talk about that, like and subscribe. According to Bren, you have to click the bell too, whatever that means. They say that music is like a language, and there are many parallels between the two. And to be even more precise, I think the parallel is most true if you consider improvisation in music and language. If there were ever a perfect analogy between language and music, it's improvisation and language. When we speak a language, it is already improvisation. That's what I'm doing right now. Like, I'm choosing my words. It just comes to me like that, and there we go. Magic. Improvisation. So these words that I'm using in the English language are improvised, but I'm not making up words like whistle, whistler. I'm essentially using the cliches and the codes of the English language to make a coherent sentence. And for the most part, I think improvisation is the same thing. You're not just making up stuff randomly out of nowhere. I mean, there is a form of improvisation like that, but in this case, it's based on the study of a genre, in this case, gypsy jazz or jazz, whatever you want to call it. So we have to become familiar with the cliches of gypsy jazz or whatever style you want to play. Naturally, there's a lot of work and preparation behind this, and we have to acquire some vocabulary. Each style of music is a language with its own code and cliches, and some styles may even cross over. But if you consider the fact that in the Western system we only have 12 notes, and often everything's based off the major or minor tonalities, each style of music uses these tones in its own way, and we're going to talk about the ones that we find in swing music. I like to read articles about jazz education or music education in general, and I often go to forums. I'm usually that troll guy who trolls everyone. So you may recognize my my username, Chris Van Hamert. You know, that dude that writes all in caps lock. So I read all these articles and people are asking, how should I learn jazz? And you get always the same responses, like, oh, learn your scales, learn your modes, your chord scales, learn your arpeggios, learn your 2-5-1s and all 12 keys. Actually, that stuff I think is really cool. It's nice to work on, but why not make it a little bit simpler? I want to introduce to you an alternative form of learning that I feel is more organic, more natural, and especially in the beginning, a whole lot more fun. And actually, this way of learning is actually no secret. This is how all the old musicians learned anyway. There are so many ways to learn, and I'm not here to tell you that this is the right or wrong way. But personally, the musicians that I really admire all learn this way, like Kanye West, Lil Wayne, the Jonas Brothers. The thing is, if you start to think in a very cerebral way, like arpeggios, modes, and all that, it can sound very academic and dry. In fact, my way of learning, I discovered the arpeggios and all the scales and everything directly from listening and not the other way around. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's use the analogy of language. Most people, when they learn a language, well, everyone actually, learns a language, their first language, through immersion. The second you are born, the people who are raising you are speaking to you in whatever language you're probably most fluent in. Actually, that's not my case. My parents spoke to me in Taiwanese. I'm not very fluent in Taiwanese, so that was not such a good example. You essentially learn language through immersion by listening and mimicking, and you eventually learn that certain sounds have a certain meaning to it. Like the word in the English language, when someone says eat, you quickly realize that has something to do with putting food in your mouth. So in music, why are you laughing?
The look on your face after you said put food in your mouth. Right?
In music, I call this learning vocabulary. So personally, I grew up speaking 3 languages from a very, very, very early age. As I said, my parents spoke to me in Taiwanese. They're from Taiwan. And I have 2 older brothers. They were going, when I was born, they were already going to school. They were going to French school here in Montreal, because for those who don't know, Montreal is a French city. And in a French province, the French province of Quebec in Canada. So French is actually the official language here. And when I went to school, it was all in French as well. When my father first came to Canada, he actually came from, if I'm not mistaken, from Switzerland, where he had just completed his PhD. He stayed in Montreal because his friend got him a job teaching like French literature or something in Cégep, which is a school system that kids go through after high school and before university. It's something unique to Quebec. So my parents were speaking to me in Taiwanese as a baby, and then from school, even before a little bit before, I started learning French as well. And then English, that's the most interesting one. I learned that by watching cartoons. You know the classics, G.I. Joe, Transformers, hey, Transformers. What else was there? Ninja Turtles, hey, Ninja Turtles. And I also used to play video games, and if you wanted to do something, you had to speak English, so you had to understand what was going on. So that's how I learned English, actually. I never went to school for English. Later in life, through circumstance, I had to learn other languages, so I'm quite well versed with the process of language acquisition. It's true that later in life, learning languages can be a little bit more difficult, and we may have to use other ways of learning, or we may have to use more academic ways to supplement the immersion process. Nonetheless, I firmly believe that immersion will always be the best way to learn, even if you have the textbooks and everything to supplement your learning. I'm currently studying Japanese. I have daily lessons. It's been going on since November of last year. We're in July for those who don't know. And this year I spent 2 months, almost 2 months in Japan. And I realized just being there, being thrown in the jungle, my Japanese level skyrocketed compared to my daily lessons with my teacher, as good as they are. Obviously, it's much harder here to learn Japanese in Montreal because I'm not in Japan. But I do my best to create a virtual environment where I'm immersed in language. So I'm watching a lot of Japanese shows like Dragon Ball, Naruto, Hunter x Hunter. And I'm even watching I have a VPN where I connect to Tokyo server so I can have Netflix in Japanese. So I'm watching Stranger Things Season 3 in Japanese. So earlier I said that improvisation is best learned in the context of a style. Why? Let's talk about it right now. So we're going to continue using the analogy of a language. Here in Canada, we had a prime minister long ago who believed that Canada should be officially bilingual, English and French. And this was an epic failure. In theory, it sounds like a really good idea, and I'm all for it. But in practice, it just didn't work. In other provinces, as I said, Quebec is the main French province in Canada. But in other provinces, French is part of the school curriculum. But if you go to other parts of Canada, people couldn't speak French to save their lives in general. Well, some people manage a little bit, but by and large, they don't speak French at all. It's true, right? It is. Yeah, it's true. Of course, we have like pockets of French communities all over Canada, so those places fare better than like metropolitan Toronto or Vancouver or something. In fact, in Vancouver, you speak Chinese. Ni hao. Lei hou. I told you about my forum username, Christian van Hemert, and it's based off of a friend of mine whose name's actually Christian van Hemert, a wonderful violinist, guitarist, plays many instruments. He has a really cool YouTube channel. Anyway, he lives in The Hague, but teaches at Codarts in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. And I was at his place actually this spring, living with him for a month. So he related to me an interesting thing that happened this past April. He was supervising the classical auditions for the next year, upcoming year, and they had applicants from all over the world for classical violin. And there was one particular person from China who played really, really well, but they had to refuse her. Why? Because she could not speak English. And her English was so bad that they had to search the school for someone who might be bilingual, and they luckily found someone to translate. So the applicant was rather confused. She asked, why am I being refused? I passed my English exams with flying colors. So you see, you go to school, you learn all this stuff, but you still can't do the actual thing. Even if you have the best grades, you can go to like an academic institution, but it still doesn't mean that you're going to be a master of your craft. I also know people in Asia who majored in French, who can't speak French. They graduated from university majoring in French, and they cannot speak French, or barely. And those that could were the ones that actually spent time abroad, like in France or here in Montreal. So too in music, I've met many people who went to jazz school, learned to improvise. In fact, they can even play over changes and everything, but they don't sound like jazz musicians at all. It's the same thing. It's because they learn all the theory, all the scales, all the arpeggios and everything. All wonderful things, really. I'm not putting that down. But they're missing the things that make a style what it is. And of course, I'm not discounting the possibility that you can create your own style. Players like Alan Holdsworth have invented their own language, and that stuff is great. If that's what you're going for, I encourage you to continue in that direction. So learning to improvise and learning to improvise in a style are two completely different skills. To just simply improvise, it's actually very easy. You just start playing notes, but you want a certain level of coherency. So maybe you learn a scale, then you can play in a key or something, and that's it. In fact, let's have Brent do this for us.
What?
I'm gonna ask Brent to demonstrate this. We're gonna play a song that's largely in the key of D, and he'll just use the D major scale, maybe D pentatonic. I know it's gonna actually be very difficult for Brent because he's a good musician, he has really good ears, but he'll try his best to demonstrate a bit of that sound. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. I can't stand it anymore. That was killing me. But was that it? Was that it? Yeah, that was a perfect example. Everything he played was 100% correct, and I can even see his good musician instincts were kicking, and he was trying to do good things. But I gave him something very limited to work with. So you see, he's playing everything correctly, but it just doesn't sound right. To my ears, and I'm sure to your ears as well, because we know what it's supposed to sound like. If you don't know this style, then maybe actually sounds good to you, and if it does, all right, then great. That already can be improvisation, and a lot of people graduating from music school, that's how they improvise as well, and some of them are even teaching in music schools, but no comment. At worst, they can't navigate the changes, and it's what I call faking your way through a song, or at best they can play the changes but like he did, but it just doesn't sound right. This is perfectly normal because they have not immersed themselves in a style. And you know, when you learn a style, you can also bring in other outside influences. I certainly do. It doesn't have to be like purist or anything like that. You should do what pleases you, but the idea is that you have to spend a lot of time listening to music that you like. You can combine, I don't know, like blues into gypsy jazz. You can combine country elements into gypsy jazz. Birelli Legren, if you don't know him, he's a guitar player. He does this really, really well. And even Django incorporated classical elements. He was into Debussy, Ravel, and things like that, and Bach. And he incorporated everything into his own unique jazz style. Let me give you another example of something that works theoretically, but just sounds like crap. If you consider a blues, like a blues in G, for those of you who don't know, a blues in G, well, there are many different ways to play blues, but let's say G7, C7, G7, C7. We'll stop here. If those chords don't mean anything to you, it doesn't matter. I'll just tell you something, that over the G7 chord, theoretically, you play what we call G Mixolydian or a G7 arpeggio. It's this, G Mixolydian. G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Over the C7, you play C Mixolydian. So you take the same thing and transpose C, D, E, F, A, B, flat, C. I'm gonna ask Brent to solo over a blues using strictly G7 and C7 arpeggios and that scale. Okay. So, does that sound anything like blues music to you? No. Or at least jazz blues. We're not blues musicians either, but let's do something in a jazz blues kind of way. And now Brent will try his best to to play an actual jazz blues. Listen to the difference. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's have Bren try to play like in a very vanilla way, very academic way, using like the Mixolydian sound and the arpeggios over a blues, a 12-bar blues. Here comes 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you hear that? Another thing that I hear like beginners do, and you can tell that they're thinking so much in terms of theory, they'll do like they'll just do like the quote unquote guide tones, like their solos. Can you do that?
Can I do guide tones? Yeah, that's what I do best.
1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so all that stuff that he plays is correct. I mean, it doesn't sound terrible, but if you know this style, then you know that no one plays this way. No good musician plays this way anyway. So now Bren is going to do his best to play a jazz blues in his own way, but in the style, because I know that Bren listens to a lot of jazz. Let's do our best. Maybe 2 courses if you're feeling inspired.
No, just one.
1, 2, 3, 4. So that was, in my opinion, that was a really nice solo. You can tell that he's playing by instinct, based on things that he's experienced in the past. We'll talk about all that stuff later, how we listen to music and how we try to absorb all that stuff. And he's still playing correctly, but it's all in the style. So you have to learn the vocabulary. At some point in my life, I realized that I hate the winter here in Quebec. It's terrible. So for a number of years, I've been spending all my winters in Taiwan. And in Taiwan, for political reasons that I will not get into, the official language is not Taiwanese, which actually is based on a language in Southeast China. But anyway, the official language is Mandarin. And since I don't speak that language, I did not speak that language, I didn't want to be left in the dust. I had to learn that language as well. I'm not saying I'm super fluent, but I get by pretty well now. How did I learn Mandarin? From my friends who taught me all the swear words first, right? And all the things that your parents would never teach you. That was very useful. And just by immersing myself in that environment, just listening and trying to mimic, and I would ask questions and then my friends would help me out. I actually did not learn through an institution. And furthermore, well, actually, I did for a month or 2. I took one class here in Montreal, and it was very funny. The teacher was from Beijing, so not only did she teach in a very academic way, but she also taught her own way, her Beijing way of speaking Mandarin, which no one in Taiwan speaks that way. You have these textbook examples, and I'll have the subtitles. 你好吗?我很好,谢谢。你呢?我也很好,我很高兴认识你. So you'll have the translation here, but here's the thing. No one in Taiwan speaks this way. No conversation ever starts this way. And so in music, when we had that blues example, we had all that Mixolydian, all that stuff, I can't think of a good musician who really improvises that way. It's about learning the cliches and the vocabulary of the style. So to me, this like textbook Chinese Mandarin example is like playing all the right scales and all the right arpeggios, going up and down, but it's like that example we did in D major, Coquette, when Bren was playing. No one sounds that way at all. So context and environment matters a lot. Here in Montreal, we have our own French, which actually mine is not exactly like that. I try to keep mine fairly neutral. But I've had to, and I also went to French school under the French system in France. But I often had to translate French for French people when they came here. So that's how different it can be. The accent and even the vocabulary. And vice versa. Sometimes I take Quebec friends with me to France and I have to translate some of the Parisian lingo. So like for example, if you wanted to live in Montreal, like I highly recommend, first of all, you come here and you learn the French that's used here. So at least you can understand what's going on. I met people, like I said, who majored in French in university from other countries. And then they come to Quebec, they have no idea what people are saying. Might as well just learn the real deal. So let's get to the topic, the actual topic. How do we learn to improvise in this jazz style? Here's my personal recommendation. Find out why it is that you even want to learn jazz in the first place. Like really specifically. Back in the day when I was taking just about every student that I could find, I used to get phone calls from people like, hey, I want to learn jazz. And I would ask them, well, why do you want to learn jazz? It's like, I'm a rock player, but I feel like I'm in a rut, and I think I need to learn my modes and everything and blah, blah, blah stuff. To me, that's the worst excuse to be learning to play jazz. I don't see how learning jazz makes you a rock player unless you enjoy that sound and you want to incorporate that sound. That's a different story. Being in a rut is a bit of a negative word, but is it such a bad thing to be settled into your style? If you look at a lot of players, B.B. King, Eric Clapton, Yngwie Malmsteen, like George Benson, Pat Martino, just give you a list of players that are from different complete styles. They settled into their style long ago, and they haven't, how to say, I don't want to use the word evolved. They've certainly matured as musicians, but they haven't really changed anything in their playing in decades. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to be stuck where you are. And then if you're dissatisfied, you have to ask yourself, why am I dissatisfied? What is it about your playing that you like? What is it that you don't like? Is your tone good? Are you able to execute the ideas that you want to play? Is your sense of time any good? Things like that. And if it's not any good, okay, you can work on the basics. You can always work on the basics, the fundamentals. And often that's far more important than learning all the modes and arpeggios in the world. And like I said earlier, you have all these players who went to, these same rock players who go to music school to learn jazz. They graduate with a jazz degree, whatever that means, but they don't listen to jazz. Maybe their teachers make them transcribe 1 or 2 solos here and there, but it's very clear to the real jazz musicians that they're not really playing in the style. Again, that's totally fine. So if you don't play in a style, that's actually totally fine. You're free to do what you want, but I think you should always do what you enjoy. Like, I don't see the point of going to a jazz school to pretend to learn jazz if you don't even listen to jazz. That's my main point. My favorite example of the good reasons to learn a style of music is when we're talking about violin here. Someone comes to me and is like, oh, I heard this recording from Stefan Grappelli. I love this stuff. I want to learn this thing. That to me is the very best reason to pick up a style, in this case jazz. That's already a huge step in the right direction, because now the path is already very clear. Because if you just say, oh, I just want to learn to play jazz, but where do I start? Here, like you heard Grappelli, you love it, you're inspired by his playing. You already have something you can do. You can try to see what he was doing to get that same sound, that same feel, the same lines. So the number one reason to do anything in life, in my opinion, is because you love it, you enjoy it, you're passionate about it. And that to me is the fundamental difference between classical music and jazz music. I'm not saying that you can't enjoy classical music. In fact, you can. But often in classical culture, it starts out this way. You go to your teacher, and your teacher says, we're going to learn this piece or that piece. And you're going to play like this, hold this like this, do this like this, blah, 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 copy me. It's a hierarchy. You don't question your teacher, you just do what they tell you to do. Hopefully you have a good teacher. I noticed among classical musicians, those who progress, go really far, are those who enjoy this process because they love the music so much. So if that's your case, that's wonderful. Whereas with jazz music, you have to learn on your own. And it's more of a lifestyle than, say, practicing X hours a day. You have to live the life. Live the life! Unlike classical music, you're not going to say, okay, today I'm going to work 30 minutes on the Dorian mode, 30 minutes on minor 7 flat 5 arpeggios, and 45 minutes on autumn leaves and all 12 keys. Yeah, you can definitely have a practice regimen like that, but it's, for me, in my opinion, based on my observations, the best way to learn is actually to adopt a lifestyle where doing all these things is already incorporated into the way you think, into the way you live. Just like a language, if you want to learn Italian, you eat pasta, you watch Ninja Turtles, you go to Italy, you hang out with Italians, and you try to immerse yourself as much in that language, as much as possible. You ask them, if you make mistakes, ask them to correct you. Like, oh, I should pronounce it this way, or this is not the right way to say it, you say it this way. You learn a lot this way. And eventually you do this so much. You also watch, you listen to the music, you watch movies, TV shows. Eventually what happens, you might even start dreaming in Italian. And that's actually the case with me. I'm often dreaming about music. I did a workshop in Asia recently for a lot of people who are new to jazz and a lot of classical musicians. One apparently really good classical musician asked me at the end of the workshop, is it true that in jazz you have to practice 12 hours a day? And I thought about that. And I said, bless you. And what was I say?
12 hours a day.
Yeah. And I thought about this, and I said, yes, you do have to practice 12 hours a day. But it's not necessarily physical practice. It's living that life that I told you about. To give you a bit of a demonstration about this lifestyle, now when I play jazz, when I improvise, I can hear, well, in ideal situations, I can hear what I want to play in advance. It's, first of all, you have to have the ability to connect things that you hear to your instrument. So that's some form of ear training, which we'll talk about. But you also have to hear something worth playing. And since I've been listening to early jazz music, to gypsy jazz and all that stuff for a very long time, and I've transcribed well over 1,000 solos in this style, and if we combine different styles, probably 2,000 solos. And it's just in my ear. Like if I take a song like Minor Swing, I can start by playing one note, and I can hear so many things. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Oh da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Dee da dee da. Dee da 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 da. It just comes to my ear. I'm not even thinking about scales or arpeggios. Take a song like All of Me. Da 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 dee da dee da. Da 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 da. Da 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 dee da 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 da. Da 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 da. It's just automatic, and it's just like a language. So that came from a lot of careful listening, thinking about music in a very specific way, which I'll share with you in a second. And actually, I want to talk to you about this mofo right here. I think I met Bren a number of years ago. I think he was still in starting cégep. They're like, what, 17 years old or something. I don't know how old we are, it doesn't matter. It was maybe 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. And I noticed something about his playing that I really liked. It's like, wow, he was starting out, but I could hear that, wow, it's going in the right direction. And I saw him progress every year, like how his vocabulary expanded, and very, very impressive. And I asked him, like, how do you practice violin? And he told me, I don't practice, I play video games. Of course. And that, to me, I think he figured out how to live the life. And that's a very important thing. Some people have to be taught how to live the life. I'll share with you some of the concepts. But some people just naturally figure it out. A lot of, since I play gypsy jazz, I'm heavily involved with a lot of musicians in the gypsy community in Western Europe. Many of them are like that as well. They just instinctively know how to do this. Some better than others. And it's even the same for me, because in the past few years I have not really been touching the guitar except for doing videos like this or teaching or occasional performances. Yet my vocabulary continues to expand because I know how to listen to music. And I know when I hear, I've transcribed so much now that in this style of music in particular, I listen to something and I know what it is right away, and I can just, as long as I know what key it's in, I can reproduce it. And I demonstrated that to you this morning with Louis Armstrong. It's like, oh, it's an A flat, boom, I did this phrase note for note without a mistake. And we'll talk about that a bit. Nonetheless, that's not an excuse to be lazy. I still think it's very important to work on your instrument. And I think you've been working on your instrument lately. Talking about playing what you hear. So I've worked with people who have perfect pitch. Perfect pitch people are people who naturally have the ability to translate anything they hear to their instrument. And I've played with such players that could improvise a coherent solo to save their lives. Why not? Because they didn't know what to play. They didn't hear. So then they rely on their knowledge of theory, their scales and arpeggios, and they end up playing a solo like Brent did over Coquette, that D major song. So the listening aspect is super important. And also be the first to admit that sometimes, actually quite often, I have off days. Sometimes I don't hear anything in my head, and that's very scary. And that's when I start to rely on my theoretical knowledge. But I'm never happy with that. It makes me quite depressed. But sometimes it's not the best day, but I can play a few notes based on my theoretical knowledge, and then those inspire some notes. So to me, that's the scary part of improvisation, but it's also the exciting part. There's this uncertainty that makes it very spontaneous and exciting. So now let's actually talk about how I recommend learning jazz in a natural way. You start by finding something that you like Kenny G, for example. And it's okay if you start with Kenny G, actually, because tastes evolve, they change, or they don't. Maybe you stay that way forever, and that's cool. But for me, I remember in the beginning, I took music lessons as a kid. I went to teachers who graduated from Berkeley, and they made me listen to all sorts of things. But I didn't get anything. I remember listening to bebop and not understanding, so it was hard for me to enjoy it. And then I discovered Django, and that, for some reason, was 1930s Django, especially. It became very easy for me to understand. Well, it didn't become very easy, but it was very easy to understand, very accessible. The rhythm was amazing. The melodies were generally very simple. And in those days, I was only interested in the simple songs like Minor Swing, Dark Eyes. Those were the songs I wanted to play. Now that I've played those songs enough time, they're still nice, but my tastes have evolved, and so that might be the case with you. And through the simple music, through Django, I was able to learn to appreciate bebop players like Wes Montgomery, George Benson. My ears evolved, and I was finally able to understand what was going on. It's really just like a language. When you're a kid, your vocabulary is really, really simple, very primitive. But as you grow older, you mature, you evolve, maybe you get into like literature, poetry and different things, or maybe you don't. Some people stay primitive forever. It's totally fine. It's the point that I'm making is that you have to find what works for you, what you enjoy.